Afternoon, everybody. I know there's been a lot of interest around the meeting between President Xi, President Putin in Moscow today. So we'll get at that. I just wanted to stop by and be available to you for that. Before I do want to quickly speak to the joint statement between the PRC and Russia that they put out today on deepening their cooperation, including on Ukraine. On Ukraine, I would note that the two sides just said, quote, "The purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be observed, and international law must be respected." Well, we agree. Following the UN Charter would mean that Russia should withdraw from all the territory inside Ukraine, the territory of another member state of the UN, a member that it has invaded. The UN Charter enshrines the principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine. Now, they also said, quote, the parties call for the cessation of all steps that contribute to escalation of tension and the prolongation of hostilities. We agree. One way to stop the hostilities is to pull Russian troops out of Ukraine, but short of that, Mr. Putin could stop bombing hospitals. He could stop bombing schools. He could stop launching Iranian drones into civilian infrastructure. He could stop the forcible deportation of young kids, thousands of them, putting them in filtration camps inside other places inside Ukraine, but also inside Russia. And he could stop reducing cities like Bakhmut to bricks, to piles of bricks. That is a way to stop the prolongation of hostilities. So now if China wants to play a constructive role here in this conflict, then they ought to press Russia to pull its troops out of Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereign territory. They should urge President Putin to cease bombing cities, hospitals, and schools, to stop the war crimes and the atrocities, and end the war today. It could happen right now. Now, with that, I'll take some questions.
The statement also says the Russian side speaks confidently of China's objective and impartial position on the Ukraine issue. Do you see China as having an impartial position on this?
No, we don't.
How do you interpret this statement?
Well, certainly I'm not going to do a book review on their statement. They can do that. They can speak to their words. But I don't think you can reasonably look at China as impartial in any way. They haven't condemned this this invasion. They haven't stopped buying Russian oil and Russian energy. President Xi saw fit to fly all the way to Moscow, hasn't talked once to President Zelensky, hasn't visited Ukraine, hasn't bothered to avail himself of the Ukrainian objective, and he and his regime keeps parroting the Russian propaganda that this is somehow a war of the West on Russia, that it's some sort of existential threat to Mr. Putin. That's just a bunch of malarkey. Ukraine posed no threat to anybody, let alone Russia. So no, it can't be seen that Russia's impartial. Now look, if he's willing to talk to President Zelensky and willing to get the other side, and we, you know, if any future potential negotiation can incorporate Ukrainian views and perspectives and can be achieved and pursued with Ukraine, as President Biden has said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. If that's the direction, then that's something that could be seen as impartial. But I just don't think right now that they can be seen that way.
And lastly, are we watching a budding alliance between China and Russia here?
I think you've seen over years now these two countries growing close together. Peter asked a question similar to that yesterday. I wouldn't go so far to call it an alliance. Yesterday I called it a marriage of convenience, because that's what I think it is. In President Putin and Russia, President Xi sees a counterweight to American influence and NATO influence, certainly on the continent and elsewhere around the world. In President Xi, President Putin sees a potential backer here. This is a man who doesn't have a whole lot of friends on the international stage. They can count him on one hand mostly. And he really needs and wants President Xi's support for what he's trying to do, because he's blowing through inventory, he's blowing through manpower. His military's getting embarrassed constantly. They've lost greater than 50% of the territory that they took in the first few months of this war. He needs help from President Xi, and that's what this visit was all about. Now, whether it results in anything, we'll see.
Go ahead, Angela.
John, two questions for you. Is the U.S. aware if there has now been an official request from Putin to Xi for lethal aid to be used in Ukraine?
I can only go by what we've seen them say today, which obviously was not part of their, at least part of the readout and part of the statements they put out today. I would tell you what I said yesterday remains true. We don't think that China's taken it off the table, but they haven't moved in that direction. We've seen no indication that they're about to or fixing to provide lethal weapons.
And my second question, the president considers Vladimir Putin to be a war criminal. I'm just wondering what it means to President Biden that Putin calls Xi Jinping a friend.
I don't think we're overly exercised about that comment. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, MJ, where they were talking about a relationship without limits, right? Partnership without limits. So we're not going to get all hot and bothered about the use of friends. What we've seen is these are two countries that are growing closer together, that see in each other useful purposes for pushing back, as I said yesterday, for chafing and bristling at a rules-based order around the world. They want to change the rules of that game. In fact, they would love nothing better, both countries, to see the rest of the world play by their rules rather than the ones that are enshrined in the UN Charter and what everybody else is following. So that's what's going on here.
Just, John, to clarify one thing, because this is what Steve asked you, it is regarding the statement, the Russian side speaks positively of China's objective and impartial position on the Ukraine issue. It is the view of this government that China is no longer impartial or is not impartial when it comes to this.
We never said China was an impartial participant here.
Does this statement, does this meeting improve or make it more difficult for President Biden to ever meet again with President Xi, at least anytime soon?
President
to
Biden-
discuss this and other issues?
The president wants to keep the lines of communication open with China. Nothing's changed about that. And as I said yesterday, at the appropriate time, we'll pursue another conversation with President Xi.
The war in Ukraine's been going on for over a year now. Is it the U.S. position that during the course of all of that time that China has not provided any lethal weaponry to Russia?
We have seen that through some Chinese companies, there may have been dual-use items that have gone, but we haven't seen any confirmation or indication that the Chinese have provided lethal weapons, lethal capabilities to the Russian Ministry of Defense throughout this conflict. They have not done that. And obviously, as I said yesterday, we don't think it's in their best interest to do that. And quite frankly, it would be inconsistent with so many of the things that President Xi has said that he wants to see as a result of this war in Ukraine, including their statements today.
Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that they have not done that yet? And do you think it has a lot to do with what President Biden has told President Xi, what EU leaders have told President Xi, and that is if they do so, they risk major sanctions being placed upon them by not only the U.S., but also by the EU, their two largest trading partners?
I certainly can't speak for President Xi. That's well beyond my writ. What I would say is we have communicated privately to the Chinese, and you've heard Secretary Blinken talk about this. We've also said it publicly, that such a move would certainly involve consequences. But more importantly, we believe, and we've said this too, that this shouldn't be seen by the Chinese as something that's in their best interest to help Mr. Putin slaughter more innocent Ukrainians, to, what's the word they used, the escalation of tension and prolongation of hostilities. Well, that's one way to do that. And again, if we're taking them at their word of what they want to see happen, it's hard to square the circle between that statement and the provision of lethal weapons. So we don't believe it's in their best interest. A country like China that has a very powerful economy and does have influence around the world, to want to see that influence stained by helping Mr. Putin murder more Ukrainians.
Go ahead, Brian in the back.
Thanks. John, I guess over here.
Thanks.
Follow up to that question, is there any indication that the visitation by Xi to Putin could lead to a de-escalation? Have you all seen anything that the statement that they put out about de-escalation, in fact, was a warning to Russia?
We're still working our way through the language here, so I don't want to get into a deep analysis, but coming out of what we've seen today, we haven't seen anything that they've said, they put forward, that gives us hope that this war is going to end anytime soon. As a matter of fact, Mr. Putin said something to the effect today, or his spokesman Peskov, I think, said something to the effect today that they're willing to negotiate, but it's the West and Ukraine that is refusing, which of course is absolutely false. So we've seen I don't think the meeting today gives us great expectations that the war is going to end anytime soon.
Quickly about the meeting today, the Xi-Putin meeting. In November, when President Biden met with Xi, he said, I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road. Does he think China is abiding by the international rules of the road?
In some cases, we have significant concerns about China's behavior, particularly their coercive and aggressive behavior, for instance, in the South China Sea and pursuing false maritime claims, concerns about intellectual theft, and some trade practices. And the president's been very open and honest about that, and he was when they met in Bali. But there are other areas where we believe there's room for cooperation with China, and we want to be able to pursue that too. But in order to do that, Peter, you got to keep those lines of communication open. You got to have that ability to talk, particularly when things are tense like they are right now. And that's what the president wants to get back to.
Thanks, Kirby. In that joint statement today, Russia and China warned against the war transitioning to a, quote, uncontrollable phase. Ukraine is preparing a counteroffensive. Does the U.S. see that part of the joint statement from Russia and China as a specific warning to Ukraine and the West?
It's difficult to know what they mean by an uncontrollable phase. Certainly, we noted that language ourselves. I can't tell you for sure that we know exactly what they're referring to. I will not speak ever about future operations, particularly for the Ukrainians. That's for them to speak to, and I wouldn't get ahead of anything that they might or might not do. We do know that President Putin is making plans to go back on the offense. I mean, he's got Wagner continuing to throw literally human flesh into Bakhmut to try to take that town. And we have every expectation that he's going to plan for other offensive operations as the weather gets better. What we want to make sure we're doing, and we just announced another package yesterday, is that Ukraine is ready to defend themselves against those offensive operations, and if they choose to, be able to conduct offensive operations of their own.
And to follow on that potential Ukrainian offensive, does Xi's support for Putin increase the stakes of any potential Ukrainian offensive?
It would depend on what that support looked like. I mean, does his visit to Moscow? I think it's hard to get to there. I think it's hard to square that circle just by going to Moscow and proclaiming that they're dear friends. But if the tangible support changes, certainly if it changes in a lethal way, then obviously that would be additive to Russian military capabilities, which of course we would all have to take seriously.
Can I follow up on something you just said about China's ability to be impartial? You just said if China can truly be impartial and Ukraine is on board for talks, is that something that the U.S. would support if Ukraine were interested in China-brokered talks?
Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. If President Zelensky, if there's a path put forward that President Zelensky can get behind and that he believes will help lead to a just peace, as he refers to it, then he'll find no better friend in that effort than the United States.
On this U.S. claim to have intelligence that China has been considering providing direct lethal aid to the Russians, and without expecting you to divulge classified information here, can you at least say that you have any insights or some window onto what kind of lethal aid the Chinese have been considering providing?
No, I'm not going to go there, James.
You don't know?
I'm not going to go there.